Hey guys, and welcome to Interview Snaps. Now, on this channel, I like to think about the future of the human species, what's going to affect politics in the next century. And clearly, one of the big things is going to be the rise of AI. AI will outcompete humans in more and more areas, probably eventually in pretty much every area. And how do we then incorporate that into a human society in which humans still have some control? And I think a clear part of that answer is going to be universal basic income, which is an idea I've become really interested in. I'm planning to do a whole series of videos on it. So if that interviews you, please do subscribe. I'll be very grateful. It will provide meaning to my life. So the first interview, which I've actually, it's not actually a video interview, it's just an audio interview. So with Scott Santens, who is a really interesting guy. He is the editor of Basic Income Today. He's advised the Andrew Yang campaign, presidential campaign. Obviously, he's now running for mayor of New York. I hope to make a video about that at some point. But he's a big advocate for universal basic income. He's very generous with his time. So yeah, thanks a lot and hope you enjoy.
On being a Scott, thank you very much for your time. I'm very grateful. So obviously, universal basic income is a very interesting idea. I mean, to what extent for you is it just a solution to technological unemployment or kind of automation unemployment, or is there more to it than that?
Oh, absolutely. There's much more to it than that. I think the technological argument is something that I think introduces a lot of people to the idea. And in fact, even I was introduced to the idea through the technological argument and wondering about automation and how to make all this technology work for us. Um, but in studying it after I got into it, that's when it really started to appear as so much more than that. And so now I like to describe it as a floor, and it's a floor that we should have had for at least decades and possibly even centuries. Even Thomas Paine, um, back at our country's founding, was talking about providing every single American a large amount of capital at turning 21. That would have been a fully universal thing. And he saw it. He saw the need for it as being like a natural inheritance that through it, basically the creation of civilization um, does a lot of good, and it's amazing that all the things we can accomplish through like property rights and creation of civilization. But at the same time, there are some people who are worse off because in the state
Yeah,
of pre-civilization, then you can go hunt and gather, you can have free access to the land and the fruits of the earth and this kind of thing. You can till the land on your own work and feed yourself. And we changed that with private property, and so he saw it as compensation for that by removing people's rights, that we have to provide people with this compensation for that removal so that no one's worse off. And I think that argument is strong and has been strong for hundreds of years. And I think it still, you know, makes even more sense now that, here we are, poverty is hugely expensive, and child poverty alone is over $1 trillion per year here in the U.S. Cost of crime is calculated over $1 trillion per year, and like we are spending, it's very costly to allow poverty to exist, to allow this lack of access to resources to exist. So I think it's about making sure that everyone has some minimum of access to resources so that you don't have this created poverty that civilization creates. And if you have that floor, then suddenly so many more things work better.
yeah,
I think healthcare is a good example. So like you can have free healthcare, you can have this national healthcare plan, and that's great, and we need it. But the problem with that is that as long as people don't have basic income, then you're treating the downstream effects of that lack of access to resources. So
yeah,
you have people who have diseases and things that they would not have had they just not been in poverty. So you can spend less on a healthcare system if you make sure that everyone has access to money in a regular, secure kind of way that reduces stress, increases access to resources, increases stability. And the same thing, you can apply that to education, that kids with full stomachs are going to do a lot better in school than kids with empty stomachs. All these things that we're doing, that government is doing, just would work better if you made sure that everyone at least didn't fall into poverty ever.
Yeah. I mean, so by the sound of things, you would have supported UBI sort of even 20, 30 years ago when technological unemployment was a much more distant prospect.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, so even when, Milton Friedman and Martin Luther King were talking about
Yeah.
guaranteeing income,
Or to Thomas More, if you go back a bit further.
yeah, we can go back even further, but if we're talking just like decades ago, then, even then there's different arguments. And so, there was um, Milton Friedman, his kind of main reasoning, his introduction to it and why he started thinking about it was the variance in incomes.
Yeah. Because he called it a negative income tax, I think, didn't he, rather than a UBI?
Yeah,
Obviously,
yeah,
it's
he called
basically the same thing, but
Yeah, and although he was asked about basic income too, and he saw them as two ways of doing, the same thing. So,
yeah,
he saw the value in both approaches, and his thinking was, hey, if people lack income, then just make sure they have income. If people's incomes are varying greatly every month, then just make sure that they get income to help, even that out. Because that in itself is a problem. And Martin Luther King, he saw poverty as being absolutely, he compared it to cannibalism, saying that there's just no reason for it to exist in our society today. And it's just people will look back, centuries from now and look at us as being essentially like cannibals as far as our allowance of and perpetuation of poverty.
yeah,
And so, yeah, and he also too saw the technological argument as well, but he combined that with the anti-poverty argument and this social justice argument of saying that it's just ridiculous that we have such inequality that people are, he described it as like overflowing like the mouths, of overfeeding like those who already have too much.
yeah.
Meanwhile, at the same time, you have people without anything, and that just doesn't make any sense.
I mean, it's very interesting to cut the kind of the technological, the way that that's exploded popularity for UBI. I mean, because you said that you yourself came to it from that position. Because it kind of seems two things have happened. So first of all, obviously UBI has become far more prominent, and second of all, it seems that a lot more, I suppose, what you call capitalists are getting interested in it. So people like Elon Musk,
Mhm.
they almost think it's necessary for liberal democratic capitalism to survive in a society where we have more and more intelligent AI that displaces us in more and more areas. I mean, do you think that's the key to it? Do you think it's becoming far more kind of cross-political now? It's not just an issue on the left.
Oh yeah. So, but I think that the technological argument has actually basically always been about what we're seeing right now, and so we're seeing the results of something similar to technology. So, like, let's say that we had just created some like really awesome artificial intelligence, and it just like immediately eliminated a bunch of jobs.
Yeah,
And so, what do you do? Like, that is, it's an incredibly fast, what we've just seen. Like the coronavirus pandemic happened, and then like bam, like just millions of jobs were just gone, and there's just no getting around that. You can't just create new jobs, especially right now because of all the restrictions and everything. And it's also very difficult to create new jobs if people's incomes have been severely impacted, and so then they're not spending as much into the economy. And then so all these governments around the world are looking at direct cash payments as this mechanism of getting out of that, because so what if you suddenly open up everything and you have no restrictions? Well, if people have less money to spend, then they're not going to be able to spend, and then that's going to be harder for these businesses to create job openings because they're not seeing the demand for it. And so it's going to be like this really slow recovery, just like from the Great Recession that took practically a decade to recover from. And so people are seeing this right now, and you can make that direct comparison to technology, and also technology suddenly makes that much more sense too. And we're already seeing those heightened investments in technology. Like you're seeing over, I think it's like 47% of I think CEOs have increased their investments in automation. And you have like robot orders and digitization from companies like have greatly accelerated. Because of course, if you have like kind of human restrictions, then you can get around that by having machines do the work that we need to be done.
Yeah.
And machines don't get sick. So, there's all these things that humans can't do right now, or at great health risk to do right now, that if you are able to automate that, then bam, you get around that problem. So here we are in a time when, like, I compare what we're seeing now to what we've been talked about for a long time. And now, even with all these jobs lost, we're going to be looking at even more jobs, not coming back ever, because
Yeah.
they're entirely unnecessary and they don't make sense. And it just makes far more efficient sense to automate that. And so, yeah, from that context, for the same reason countries across the world are looking at direct payments, suddenly universal basic income makes more sense now, through that. And I also like to point out too that it's always like it's interesting to see this argument. It's always, like, oh, there's going to be lots of jobs or there's not going to be any jobs. And that's not really the way that automation works. And automation has been impacting us for decades. It just hasn't been in this typical kind of complete job loss situation. So automation actually pushes down on wages.
Yeah.
As jobs get automated, then the people have to go back into the labor market, and so you can lose your job. Let's say you had like a $50,000 manufacturing job, and that gets automated, and so then you have to go back in the labor market because you need income to live. And so you just find what you can find. And a lot of times people, with higher degrees are finding jobs that they're overskilled for, but it's all they can find. So now they get like a 20K job. And so, like, yeah, they're employed, but they're not earning as much. And you also see like the benefits being different. So, you could have like a great job with great benefits and then lose that. And then you end up finding a job that has no benefits. And maybe the job you find too is, insecure. And, it's something where you're not working 40 hours a week. Now you're working maybe two jobs. Hopefully you are able to get 20 to 40 hours, but you never really know. Or maybe you're doing gig labor and it's not even really hourly, but you're just trying to find tasks to fulfill for money. Like, this has been this constantly changing picture over the decades. And so here we are now with, wages have been stagnant for decades and people can spend less, and they're experiencing much more precarious incomes and lives. And universal basic income is something that can, it's that floor that's missing that can really
Yeah.
lift people up from these effects of automation that have already been with us. And I argue too that, we shouldn't be looking at automation as like this scary kind of prospect. Like, we are more productive. We're twice as productive in America right now than we were in the early 70s. And so what did that do? you know, like, you would think that being twice as productive should mean that we should all be working half as much for just as much income,
Yeah.
or we should all be earning twice as much for the same amount of hours. And of course, none of that happened. All of the productivity flowed to the very top. So the problem is not automation. It's just that the fruits of automation are being concentrated in a very small amount of hands. And so we have to make sure that that is distributed evenly across the entire country so that, we all benefit from automation instead of only a few people.
I mean, one thing I found very interesting about Andrew Yang's campaign was he's talking about automation being a factor, perhaps not the main factor, but a factor in the rise of Donald Trump. So,
Right.
obviously having unemployment in kind of Midwestern states. If that's the case, and obviously if automation is likely to continue to intensify, which is the expected trajectory, you'd expect that to continue. So do you think that something like universal basic income is needed to stop kind of a type of kind of authoritarian right-wing populism
Yeah.
developing out of the kind of the massive automation?
Yeah, I totally agree with this hypothesis that that kind of what we're seeing both with Trump and Brexit and other places as well, that this kind of Trumpism in like a this rise of populism is happening as a result of people losing this sense of security that they had. In America, in the the Rust Belt states, that we had this great manufacturing capacity. And it's interesting, if you ask people, what has happened to American manufacturing, like most people will say that we've lost manufacturing, and they're wrong. The fact is that our manufacturing has gone up way, it's continued going up this entire time. It's just the jobs have gone down. So
Yeah,
we as a country are producing more than ever, but there's just no jobs to actually make that, the jobs aren't responsible for that. It's the machines, it's the technology. Um, so this life that people thought they were going to have, especially if you're non-college educated, it was like the American dream went to everybody, and you could just graduate high school and get a good job and have a secure life and family, and you could even be like a one earner household and live this quote unquote American dream. And that's disappeared. Like, if you look at the uh, this described as deaths of despair, which is deaths caused by suicide or as a result of drug overdoses, death by like alcohol abuse. Um, these deaths are on the rise, to the point where here in the U.S. We've actually had, I think it's like 4 years now of declining lifespans.
yeah.
And this was of course before the pandemic, and you could only compare that fall to the previous pandemic, a century ago. And here we are. And what's interesting about that too is, if you have a college degree, then you're practically inoculated to those deaths of despair.
Yeah,
If you do not have a college degree, then you are the one who is suffering from these deaths of despair in a big way. And so I think that kind of thing is going to result in, anger, that you're going to result in people wondering, how to get out of this, or if Trump comes along and he promises good jobs, he promises, return of the American dream, and return of manufacturing, and all these things that you feel that are gone, you're going to go for that. And they did. And here we are. So, and I think that's going to just keep on happening. Like, we really do need to make sure that people have secure existences, because living with like chronic stress and not knowing what's going to happen really just makes for bad outcomes. You're going to be seeing, it's like a like how forest fires work. It's like, if everything's dry and then, the conditions are like long stretches of heat, and there's hardly any moisture around, then lightning strikes and bam, you've got yourself like a ginormous forest fire.
yeah,
And it would never have happened. Like, you'd still have had that lightning strike in different conditions, but it would not have caused like this giant forest fire. And so I think that's where we are right now, is like we've been just decades of drying up everything, and now you're just gonna these lightning strikes like Trump are going to cause like much more trouble than they ever
yeah.
would have before.
I thought it was very interesting that you said about college graduates generally being kind of inoculated from this,
Mhm.
from automation, because obviously at the moment it's mainly happening in more manual jobs. But presuming that will change as AI improves and becomes more capable in more and more areas. So this kind of political radicalization that we've been seeing in a section of the kind of the blue collar workers could that potentially spread to white collar jobs as well, or people would traditionally would
Oh,
have had white collar
absolutely.
jobs?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to see just what has happened with skills polarization over the decades. And so, if you can imagine a line chart where on the left is low skills, and then the middle is medium skills, and the high is high skills. And so, over the decades, we've seen that the middle skill jobs have been decreasing in number, and
Yeah,
every decade the low skill jobs has been increasing, and over that same time, except for more recently, the high skill end has been decreasing, and it's only had like a little bit of a spike, a little bit of more like growth than what it was. But most of this has been like just a story of growth in low skill jobs over the decades, and it's mostly coming from the middle, but the middle is like getting larger. So it's almost like a kind of a sinkhole kind of an action where as it gets larger, then um, you're able to automate jobs that were too cheap to automate, but technology gets cheap enough that now it can take those jobs. And so as technology gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, then it's able to do lower skill work, because even though humans have a capacity to continue to, underbid themselves in order to get any amount of money instead of, poverty money, not having any money at all, then you're going to continue eating away to the left. But then also there is that problem to the right too, where it's not that technology gets cheaper. Um, it's although it's part of that, but also because it gets better, it gets more and more
yeah,
capable. So there are these jobs that people have long considered to be, oh, that'll never be done by a machine. And yeah, when it comes to deep learning, artificial intelligence, then that's not true. Like you
yeah,
absolutely can do a lot of these, medical jobs, legal jobs, this stuff that, was six figures. And of course, that makes a lot of sense to automate because those jobs are worth so much. And so there's more incentive to automate those jobs. And great in some degree, we want that again, that it's great to have that increased productivity, especially in these really expensive jobs. um, but again, you will be making it more difficult to find those jobs. You will need to make sure that people can educate and retrain and find and create these new jobs. And all these things take time too, and that's a big part of this discussion that tends to go undiscussed as well when people say, oh, well, we'll create new jobs. And it's like, well, yeah, of course we will always be creating new jobs, but the problem is the displacement rate too.
yeah. I mean, do you think, I mean, probably some distance in the future, do you think we can end up in a society where, because obviously, the vast majority of human history, we've all had to do pretty much compulsory labour. I mean, there's always been a few people who've been rich enough not to, or worked, lived on other people, etc. But do you think we could create a society where we essentially live off the produce of automation? So where work is entirely voluntary. Many people may never work a day in their lives, and you just entirely have a life of leisure based on automation and AI. And I mean, not imminently or in the midterm, but kind of some long term in the future.
Yeah, it's funny when you say like not working a day in your lives. A quote that I think of is from Mark Twain, and he said that he never worked a day in his life. And he described the difference being between voluntary labor, and is the writing that he did was of course pleasure, like he enjoyed that, and he didn't consider that to be labor at all. And it's the people who have, if you find your own labor, then it's not really work. And but if you find someone else's labor, then that's work. And so I absolutely think, I mean, we could do that right now as far as making work fully voluntary. And again, that's another reason why I think basic income is so important, is because I think all work should be voluntary. And it's not about saying that in order for work to be voluntary, you have to have robots doing it. Like, all you have to do is make sure that people have enough money unconditionally that they can choose, what it is that they want to do and at the
Yeah,
rate that they want to do it. So if you have a basic income, then you can do your own thing. You can be like a writer and maybe be like the next Mark Twain. And or you can not do that and say, well, I'll do some job, but I'm not going to do it for, $7 an hour. I think that's just too little, but I will do that job for, say, $20 an hour, And so that lack of bargaining power is actually part of the problem going on too, is that, people are willing to do jobs for far too little money, and because of that, then you have all sorts of exploitation of employers and low wages and everything else. And so like part of the problem is the fact that human labor is too cheap,
Yeah.
that we we would have already automated so much more stuff, but for the fact that people are so cheap.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do want to do is that we want to make labor more expensive, so that then it makes more sense to automate more, and then we can free even more of our labor up, be doing our own things, that we can be finding our own pursuits. And it's not about just leisure, it is about like finding what gives us like meaning and purpose in life. And there's lots of work out there that people can find that will do that and does do that, but it's just a matter of freeing up our capacity, to do that. Just like unpaid work is another good example too, where is someone not doing anything if they're doing unpaid care work? Well, of course not. Like they're doing extremely meaningful and useful contributory work to society
Yeah.
by doing the unpaid care work. But like, you can't do that unless you have some means of ability to do that. Like if you can't do that if you're starving in the streets. Like you can do that if like you're with like a rich partner, and so you're not worried about that. Then you can pursue like volunteering. And you see that a lot of people with when with retirees, you're on Social Security, and you don't have to quote unquote work anymore. You're receiving this retirement pension. But then what do you see? Well, you see they do a lot more volunteering. They do a lot of working in local government, like running polling sites for during elections. And there's so much work that they still do, especially even this unpaid care work as well, even though they don't have to, they're choosing to.
Oh, this is very much a curveball, but I've interviewed on this channel quite a few transhumanist thinkers at various times. I don't know if you're familiar with the movement at all.
Oh, I'm familiar. Yeah.
So obviously they start the same problem, which is rising power of AI. What are humans going to do? And their solution, rather than providing a universal, or a lot of them do support universal basic income, but their core solution is, rather than providing a kind of universal basic income, is you increase human capacity in the long term to compete with incredibly advanced AI. You either in some way merge human and artificial intelligence, or you just biologically alter humans essentially. I know that stuff's all very, very far-fetched. I know we're getting into slightly sci-fi territory, but is that an argument that you think has any merit?
Well, and I don't consider it as being like a reason for basic income. It's because again, we could have had basic income centuries ago, and it just doesn't need this technological argument to
Yeah.
be part of it. And also, I think it's kind of silly to think that in this world that's extremely unequal, when only like a few corporations are reaping all the benefits of productivity, and you can have like an Elon Musk who like owns the AI, who is able to do like so much work that humans find themselves needing to compete against. And then so humans upgrade themselves in order to compete against the machines. Like, that seems to me like a really dystopian kind of take on things, where why are we upgrading ourselves in order to compete against machines that should be working for us? Like, that doesn't make any sense. If all of these advances, they should be lifting everybody up equally. You should have this rising floor. And so that's how I see it too, is let's create like this poverty floor, so that
Yeah.
we eliminate poverty, and then let's make sure that it rises as productivity rises. So, as our economy, as our civilization is able to do more and more with less and less, then we should have, a greater percentage of access to those collective resources. So, I see let's say if we're looking, like a century down the road or whatever, then, we're much more productive. I don't know what we'd be, but let's say we're 10 times more productive. So that means that the equivalent, let's say we have a $10,000 UBI floor right now and decided to tie it to productivity, then essentially a century from now, people would have $100,000 worth, of UBI
Yeah.
that in today's dollars. So, that's to me is a more utopian kind of scenario where we're saying, okay, if we're more and more productive, then let's make sure that we're essentially all wealthier and we're not competing against the machines. All the machines are working for all of us collectively. And let's also, rethink this whole 40-hour work week thing, like that's ridiculous that we used to have 80-hour work week and we used to have a 60-hour work week, and then we went down to 40 and we just stuck there, and we've watched all these productivity increases go to the top instead of working less. And I think that we
Yeah.
need to get back to that. And so also a century from now, we should have like a 5-hour work week. What are the fewest amount of hours that people need to do work that they don't necessarily want to do, but they're willing
Yeah.
to pitch in, like maybe if you have $100,000 worth of UBI, you don't want to do, people you would usually say like, cleaning the toilets. Like, who will clean the toilets? And it's like, well, who will clean the toilets? Well, okay, so we can either automate that, so we'll have like self-cleaning bathrooms or like,
Yeah.
toilet cleaning robots, and whatever, can't be done by technology. Well, let's pay people a lot of money to do the stuff that people don't want to do. So then, a toilet cleaning job should be like $100,000 job, in the situation where no one wants to do it. Um, and also, instead of having a 40-hour a week job, cleaning toilets, then yeah, just do it a couple hours a week.
Yeah.
And I think most people would be willing to do things for society that is giving so much to them, if everyone chips in. So I think that's a matter of looking into it too, is thinking of like the work week as something that we're all chipping into, and then we should be getting smaller and smaller over time.
I mean, it seems, and obviously you mentioned this earlier, but you would have supported UBI some time ago. You think it could have been introduced some time ago. Do
Yeah.
you think there's a technological unemployment which is actually going to result in it being introduced? I mean, clearly it's seen a huge explosion of interest over the past sort of 5 years or so, and most of that seems to be linked to technological unemployment. Do you think that's going to be the factor that actually makes it happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could almost say that what we're seeing right now is going to make it happen. That the pandemic, it
Ah,
really opened up doors that have remained closed, and so I'm not going to rule out that someone isn't going to at least do temporary basic income, as a result of the pandemic.
yeah,
Like, we still don't know, how is this going to work out. Like, for all we know, that maybe one of um, the mutations that have already taken place, is going to basically shut everything down again, or maybe a mutation hasn't happened yet that's going to be worse and not impacted by the vaccine. Like, there's still unknowns as far as the pandemic goes, and we've still we're facing this problem that automation has always been talked about as the problem, where what do you do when a large percentage of the population is permanently long-term unemployed?
yeah,
And well, the situation is UBI. And we're seeing all this too, like even right now in the US, the discussion, there's a debate about the stimulus checks, the next stimulus checks. So like Biden has promised $2,000. And if we won Georgia, then and the Democrats won the Senate, then $2,000 right out the door. And so here we are, a couple weeks into his administration now, and the checks haven't been sent out yet, and he's open to, um, you know lowering the qualification threshold for people to receive those checks. Like, that's kind of the debate among Democrats right now, is because Republicans want this. And then so if for this to be bipartisan, then you lower the qualification line so that instead of previously you would get the check up to $75,000 and it would draw down after that. Then now it's like, well, let's move it to $50,000. And so if you make under that, you get the full amount, and you over that, then you get this reduced amount until you get nothing. And of course, this debate is causing, well, why would we do that? From a political perspective, why would you include fewer people? Like it's a slam dunk politically to make sure that the checks go to more people so that you essentially help more voters, and then they're more likely to vote for you next time around. Like, it makes no sense politically to reduce the amount of recipients of the check. But also economically, what is that? So economically, we don't know like who is suffering with these, reduced incomes, who are still employed, and especially using old data. So like right now they're talking about, you're going to be giving these checks based on earnings in 2019. And of course, 2020 is when everything happened. So, here in 2021, it makes no sense whatsoever to be using 2019 data and pretending that who is in need and who isn't. And so, because of that, it's making the universality argument make far more sense, because you don't know who needs and who doesn't. So, let's make sure everybody gets it, and then you can worry about any clawback on the back end via taxes next year, after all is said and done. So there's a lot of things going on during the pandemic that just really highlight the need for UBI in the same kind of perspective as technology already did. And again, technology is just further being advanced by this. So I think that, yeah, at some point there's going to be a breaking point in some country, and they're just going to realize that, okay, this really does make sense. Like,
Yeah.
let's stop targeting. Let's actually do clawback on the back end. Let's make sure that everyone actually has this floor, that you're not having to go through the bureaucracy, that people aren't falling through the cracks and the holes in the safety net, that you're actually protecting everybody, and also that you're boosting the economy so that people have spending, they're able to spend in their local economies, that sustains and creates new jobs, and you're able to rocket out of this recession. And I think that'll be really interesting for the first country that does that. I think would show the rest of the world that this really does work well, especially economically, and I think also politically. But both of those will be exemplary as far as that showing it works. And then I think that'll put even more pressure on other countries to do the same, because the choice is, well, why would you not do that? If this other country shows that you can end the recession quicker and actually stimulate their economy and grow their GDP faster, and people are healthier and happier and well-being's up, productivity's up, like everything, it makes far more sense to do that. And yeah, because someone's already done it.
Yeah. I mean, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of very interesting trials taking place. So, I mean, obviously, there were some which are kind of almost accidental trials. So, a lot of very oil-rich states, I think Alaska included. When I say oil-rich states, I mean countries in the Middle East and Alaska have something which is quite close to universal basic income. But obviously, there have been major studies in places like Finland. I mean, have you been kind of, because I saw the finished result, it seemed to be that it had a major increase on people's well-being, or improvement on people's well-being. The impact on employment seemed pretty negligible. I mean, neither negative nor positive. And would you say that the trials so far kind of borne out your conclusions?
Well, so actually, first of all, like Alaska is, I think, the best example of UBI in the world. That's been operating since 1982, and everyone in Alaska gets the same amount of money as everyone else in Alaska every year. And so, we're able to look at that and see the effects that it's had. So we've seen that, because of that, it's stabilizes the Alaskan economy. It has it been the equivalent of like an entirely like new industry, as in like effectively job that creates part-time employment has increased. 17% actually. And there's been no increase in full-time employment. It's been like a net zero effect, basically,
Yeah.
mostly in part-time. Um, but there's like fewer people. There's like a negative impact on full-time employment. At the same time, the increased spending creates more jobs. That there's actually an increased full-time employment. So then those kind of balance each other out. But the self-employment is definitely a large net positive impact. And you see like crime goes down when the distribution happens. You see it's had an obesity has gone down. You see an impact on that. Um, so there's like a lot of positive impacts that we just see from Alaska from like a long term kind of thing. And yeah, like the closest country that have, I wouldn't describe every, Middle Eastern country as doing it. Like some people think Saudi Arabia is an example, but it's absolutely not an example because essentially you have to be the royal Saudi family. And then like kind of your distance from it uh, determines like the amount of money. So, if you're like
Yeah.
a couple removed, then, you'll get, 30 or $40,000. And, if you're not really related, you'll get nothing. And if you're, at the heart of it, you get a ton. So that's not really a good example, but like Iran is a good example because they had an oil subsidy and they decided to cash out the oil subsidy and provide a practically universal amount of cash to people instead to compensate for the increase in oil prices. And at one point, 96% of the country got this cash transfer. And so at that point, it was essentially UBI. And so since then, it's not reaching, 96% because they're like, oh, there's too many really rich people getting this. Let's like make sure that we add more stipulations and whatever. And so I think right now it's like around 50 to 60% of the country maybe gets it. So like I
Yeah.
wouldn't call it UBI now, but at one point it basically was, and there's some interesting impacts from that. The research has shown that self-employment went up and had a good impact on, it did not have a negative impact on, full-time employment, same as Alaska. So those are interesting, but like Finland is a good example too. So there's some misinformation regarding Finland uh, because of the fact that it was a multi-year pilot, and in the middle of it, they decided not to expand the pilot as researchers had originally hoped. And so people read that as thinking that they had like canceled the pilot. So then lots of people thought that it like failed, even though that wasn't at all what happened. And then they had a halfway preliminary report of the first year that was released, and then that one was one that was not finding any positive impact on employment. So then people thought, oh well, that failed, it hurt employment or whatever. And it's funny that people like a lot of people don't know that the final report came out, like last March, and they're still talking about that they'll still link to like the preliminary reports, but like
Yeah.
the final report came out and people actually worked more. And so yeah, it was slight. I
Okay.
think it was like uh, 6 days more, out of the 2 years um, versus the control group. So like it's small, but it wasn't negative either. Like people did actually work more because of the basic income. And so then it's important to understand the context of that too, that this was going to 2000 um, unemployed Finns. And so a big part of the impact of the employment impacts of basic income comes from the increased spending. So you're not going to increase spending enough from 2000 people spending money all over Finland to see, people,
Yeah.
employers open up more jobs because of the increased demand. That just doesn't work that way. So that's the part that people don't get either. And that even though it didn't have that, increase in demand, you still actually saw people working more, and it was slight. So if you combine those two, then obviously we should see people um, working more, because the incentive is better. And that's really all they were testing, was that they took the unemployment benefit that already existed in Finland and said, okay, well, let's just make sure that instead of pulling it back as people work more, they can keep it.
Yeah.
And well, the result is that they work more because, of course, that makes sense. And so if you combine that with people spending more, then you should see people working more.
This is just my perception. This may be completely incorrect, but it kind of, I mean, obviously UBI has always been an idea around in some form on the left. I mean, that's kind of inevitable. It's the government controlling money and handing it out. But it does seem that the right's starting to get a lot more interest in it. So, I mean, in the UK, for example, I mean, the Labour Party pledged at the last general election to have a trial if they won, which they obviously didn't. But more recently, very recently, the Liberal Democrats, the kind of centrist, maybe very slightly centre-left party, but they're definitely not leftists. They've endorsed the policy wholeheartedly. And even quite a few Tories are starting to talk about it. So, I mean, I don't know if you're seeing the same thing in America, Republicans taking an interest in this, but with right taking an interest in this.
Yeah, I'm actually really excited recently about Mitt Romney's proposal that he just introduced just a couple days ago, and that was for a child allowance, like a universal child allowance here. And so that would essentially be a basic income for families, and it would be $250 per kid under age 5 and under, and I mean, sorry, $350 for 5 and under, and then over 5 would be $250 per month, and that's per kid. Um, and then maxes out at $15,000 per family. So then the maximum, kind of depends on age and number of kids. But that would be, a family could be receiving $15,000 per year. And so yeah, that's a basic income. And it's interesting too to see that it's essentially a return to Nixon's family assistance plan. Back when he announced it in '69, and we it went through the House here in the U.S. It passed in '70 and '71, but it didn't make it through the Senate. But if it had, that would have guaranteed a income for families that varied by household size. And so it's just really interesting to see, that was a conservative president, and here Romney is proposing this as a conservative. And the conservative argument that he is making is that under the existing system that we have, that he wishes to replace with this monthly child allowance, that the existing system has penalties for marriage. And it's true. If you look at the way that it works, it really does. It's mostly built around single parent households,
Yeah.
and there are penalties in place essentially for you know couples. The general argument is that, well, if there's two of you, then there's less need for government assistance, and so why would we give you any? But the result of that is that you were effectively punishing couples. And so if you remove that and actually make it so everybody gets this universally per kid, instead of looking at structure of the household, then you can actually strengthen and increase the number of people who are married. And so that's like a conservative argument, that they're interested in the nuclear family, that they want two parent households for kids, that that's, to them, that's an important part of um, you know society structure, and that's what he's proposing. So I hope that conservatives latch onto that, and they focus less on this, like, oh my gosh, people are getting money for nothing kind of aspect that they have traditionally looked at so much, and instead they see this as, well, look at all these positive things that happen, that we could actually incentivize nuclear families, that this could be a return of, like, communities and churches, and
Yeah.
these kinds of things are important to them. And, you know, also just as a return to kind of what Milton Friedman thought, where, you know, Milton Friedman recognized the negative income tax as being pro work. You know, he didn't say, you know, that oh my gosh, this is money for nothing. That he said, no, look, if you make sure that you start with a floor, then any amount of work that you do will add to it. And right now, under the existing welfare system that's focused on targeting, then it gets pulled away. And so, you know, if your decision that you're making, if your choice is, all right, I have $1,000 per month of welfare and a job is offering me $1,000 per month, and if I take the job, then I lose the welfare, then I'm still at $1,000 a month, but now I'm in a job that I don't like. So why would you do that? Like, the only reason you do that is because you have structure. It's not good for earning income. There's a work disincentive. And so just like Finland studied, you know, that's what they were looking at, was the work disincentive. And so if Republicans, or, you know, if conservatives in general start to really see that and understand that there is a work disincentive under a targeted system, and that you remove that with a basic income system, then I think that that's something that conservatives could really get behind.
Yeah. I mean, just one final question. So you've been very generous of your time, but it does sort of have two parts. It obviously feels like there's a lot of momentum building for UBI. I mean, do you think we're approaching a tipping point where some major Western country, I mean, probably Western, maybe not Western, will implement this, and that'll kind of set off a cascade of lots of different countries doing it? And also, I mean, how important do you think as Andrew Yang personally has been in popularizing the movement?
Yeah. So on the first point, I do think that we're reaching a tipping point, and I really am curious who will be the first country to like really do this in like a a more permanent way. But so like there is a country. Gosh, I can only remember what the country is. It's such a small country, and it's just eluding me right now. But there is a country that actually, it's one of those like small island countries, and so
Yeah.
they're doing a temporary, you know, basic income. So like universally, everyone in this country is receiving a basic income during the pandemic. And so yeah, I don't. It's a small country, and it's not something that, you know, a lot that a lot of other countries are, you know, saying, oh, we can do that. But still, they did it. And there have been countries that have done fully universal payments, you know, for the pandemic. Like Japan was one, and Israel did a fully universal payment. So there have been like one-off universal payments, and there also have been temporary recurring payments, like you know, Canada, um, and their $2,000 per month. You know, that was you know, targeted towards the unemployed and you know, like gig workers and unemployed. But like, it's getting closer. So I think it's not too much of a stretch to, especially if, you know, whatever happens with the strain variants, um, and also just how long these like recessions resulting are, that a country could do this. And yeah, and I think that one country that's big enough to really make a splash could do it. And it could, you know, it could be Western country, it could be Eastern. Like I think that Japan already had a really good, you know, reasoning to go with basic income, because, you know, they've experienced this just decades of deflationary impact, where their economy is just not growing the way that it could be, because they're fighting deflation. And it's like, you know, if you want to really fight deflation, then what you should do is just create more money and provide it to everyone. Like, that's really going to create an inflationary counter to that deflation. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Japan, you know, was to do it, or it could be China. You know, it could be, you know, it's really up in the air, and it's you know, take your pick kind of gamble. But I do think that we are close to somebody at least doing it in like 6-month or a year kind of way. And I'm hoping that the US will be that. Like, I'm still pushing for recurring stimulus checks to be what America starts doing. And that's a fight. And it's kind of a one step at a time. We got the first check out. We got a check for 1,200. We got a check for 600. I'm pretty sure we're going to. Biden is already saying there will be a check for 1,400. So that's 3 checks so far, and it just each check builds the case more for just make it monthly. Stop doing these one-off checks. Just like make it monthly in any amount. It could be 500. It could be 1,000. It could be preferably it'd be 2,000. But like anything that's monthly would be a huge step forward. And then as far as Andrew Yang is in this picture, yeah, I mean, I think that that we even as a country looked so quickly at checks. I think because of his candidacy, that um, I think that maybe if he hadn't run, maybe we would have jumped to harder to like the tax deduction. We said, oh, let's just reduce payroll taxes and do the unemployment insurance boost as like we did, instead of the unemployment insurance boost plus stimulus checks. Like, I think that he primed the entire country for just getting checks out, and I think that that's a huge change for the better. And I also think that he really helped grow the base of support politically, so that there is more a political like group pushing for this. Like, I think the mayors for guaranteed income is the I think the probably the biggest, most impressive thing that happened as a result of all this last year, where now I don't even know what the current number is. I think it's up to maybe 34, 35 mayors have joined the mayors for guaranteed income. And there's over 30, you know m- each mayor is now starting up the process of launching a pilot in their city. My own is included. That I was able to reach out to my mayor and get her on board, and we're launching a pilot here in New Orleans, and 30 plus others are launching theirs, and a lot of this is made possible by Jack Dorsey, who came out. He put $1 billion into a fund, called it the Start Small Fund, focused on basic income and also women's education. And it's interesting, like over the past year, just as the rich have gotten richer, that $1 billion of fund, because it was set aside as stock, has grown to almost $4 billion now. So there's even more money that's available to help launch these pilots. And a lot of it's coming from Jack, and other people are getting on board, and other people are figuring out that you don't even need that you can actually reallocate existing revenue sources and just do things differently in your cities. And yeah, I think a lot of that goes back to Andrew Yang, that the Yang gang built up. There's a lot of people learned about basing for the first time and started getting serious and involved. And I think that base of activism support has really made a difference here in the U.S. and I think in other places too. Um, but yeah, I think that if he had not run, I do think things would be going differently in a worse way.
Yeah. So, Scott, it's been a real pleasure. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, James.